This is a game that I wasn't really expecting to like, but I'm pleasantly surprised, as I'll get into in a second. Uh, Basically the game follows on from Sam's daughter being killed in Double Agent. Excuse me, keep looking at the screen. There's a hell of a lot of notes I've taken on this game. Sam's now out of third echelon and wants to find out basically who's responsible for his daughter's death. With him being out of third echelon, this time you're basically on your own, and Sam's been ramped up when it comes to brutality in a big way. While it still embraces the stealth elements of Splinter Cell, instead of sort of keeping the game slow, Fish is now more of a predator type character. Basically strikes hard and fast from the shadows rather than needing to be careful about picking targets and taking shots from the dark. Definitely a massive contrast to what we've seen so far in the franchise. There's a new element that I touched on in one of the conference videos called Mark and Execute. Basically Fisher can tag targets at any point, and the number of tags that he can do depends on what weapon he's carrying. The targets don't necessarily need to be enemies. They can be pretty much anything from lights to traps. The dots basically turn from white to red dependent on whether you've got a clear shot or not. When it turns red, hitting the execute button, Sam will then pop out of cover for basically a guaranteed one-shot kill. The AI for the system itself basically prioritises. IGN basically use an example that you can say you've got a group of enemies and a chandelier, and there's an enemy just outside of the range of the chandelier itself. You can tag the chandelier and then the enemy outside of the radius of where the chandelier will fall. Hitting the execute button, Sam will then shoot the chandelier first, as it's basically the biggest distraction, and then drop any enemies that are still alive after the chandelier's fallen. In the same token, if you tag, say, 2 lights on one enemy, the light will get shot out first, as the AI basically reads the light as being a longer term distraction in case his enemy's just off screen. Basically, as a general rule, the AI will then shoot the second light, but if the enemy AI then turns to shoot at you, it will basically gauge that as being the biggest threat and attack the enemy before then taking out the second light. It's nifty stuff if it does actually work. While potentially this can sort of result in overuse, basically becoming like a Splinter Cell for dummies, Ubisoft are basically promising that with the volume of enemies that you'll be facing, sole reliance on Mark and Execute will be completely impossible. Instead, players will basically have to utilise a mix of Mark and Execute and sort of straight up first person shooter styles. A little bit like Fallout 3, where you're not always able to play in like the VATS mode. This time stealth meters are gone completely. Instead you basically get like a graphical touch. So when you're out of plain sight, the colour will basically drain from what you're seeing on screen. And when you then come out of cover, like the colour then flashes straight back in. Colour's not drained from like special objects that you can interact with. Might sound a little bit gimmicky, but when you consider the fact that at the heart of this game it is still stealth, but basically implementing this as a system in and of itself, it keeps the pace up. Basically it sort of gets across that feeling that Sam doesn't care about anything but basically just finding out the truth. And on that token, there's now no more need to basically hide the bodies. Another new element that's pretty self-explanatory, but it's called last known position. Basically, if you're spotted by an enemy, where you're spotted, you'll see like a silhouette of Sam. Basically, as a result of that, enemies that have seen where your last known position is will then make a beeline for that. which then basically it gives you sort of that cat and mouse mechanic where you can set up traps or flank your enemies and what have you. As the story progresses, you'll then have third echelon come after you. These guys don't have that sort of stupidity of the standard enemies that you'll be fighting, and instead of basically having last known position working to your advantage, instead of them making a charge for that position, they'll do things like try and flank around, so they'll get a better shot at that spot, throw grenades to where your last known position was. And that's basically where like your learning curve and tactics are done, you basically have to kick in, and you're going to have to absolutely shine to get around those. Melee's now a one button affair. The style's actually taken from an existing style, and apologies to any Israelis watching, it's taken from, I think it's called Krav Maga defense, which is basically used by the Israeli army, and basically it promises to be sort of vicious with plenty of like bone breaking and cartilage busting action. Interrogations use this sort of Fisher brutality. Basically anything goes. For those of you that have seen the live demo, the toilet interrogation scene's a perfect example, where you can basically use the environment around you to basically be as sort of visceral as you like, but without the risk of killing the person that you're trying to interrogate. Sort of promoting that sociopathic side in everybody. The story progresses, like I've said again in the Microsoft conference video, in real time. For those of you that haven't seen, instead of like getting cutscenes or audio information coming through, as you're walking around the game map, you'll see like projections up on walls and what have you, as well as like flashback sequences and little video sequences, but you can still move through, so it doesn't sort of draw away from what you're actually doing. And to be perfectly honest, it's something that I'd love to see done in a lot more titles, not just like your stealth titles. When you consider the fact that I've never really been a massive Splinter Cell fan, with the amount of information that I've gone into, you can tell that I'm definitely one of the people that's looking forward to seeing this game come out.